the Japanese Shogunate. So, class, we've now reached the easternmost spectrum of the lands we will be discussing in the 1750s. The Japanese Shogunate. The Tokugawa Shogunate, to be more specific. So now we will be taking a look at the island of the rising sun, Japan. So, feudal Japan. So, Japan for many generations had been dominated by a system where military aristocrats, warrior aristocrats, dominated society. Now, it's very similar to medieval Europe. You had the daimyo, who were the local lords, similar to the barons and thanes of medieval Europe. And these lords reigned over areas of land that they personally owned as their private possession, and these lands were worked by their peasants. Now, the daimyo enforced their rules, laws, and wills through warriors, aristocratic warriors sworn to serve them. These warriors were known as the samurai, and they are roughly analogous to the knights of medieval Europe. Both the samurai and the knights came from a level of aristocratic society, though not a level as high up as the lords they served. Both lived by certain rules and law codes that governed a sense of honor among them. Both engaged in vengeance and feuding behavior, and both samurai and knights had a moralistic and religious dimension to the vows they took. How religious they were in actually carrying out their duties, one varied intensely from warrior to warrior, just as it does with all human beings, and two was probably less so than the vows would make you believe, but nonetheless, that dimension was there. So, let's look a little more at Japan. Now, as mentioned before, vengeance had been a big part of how things were done. Famous stories of vengeance persist, like the 47 Ronin who avenge their daimyo when he's wrongfully executed, and they wait years to carry out their vengeance. And all quite glorious and is very interesting. However, this kind of chaos was bad for government. So, beginning around 1165, the shogun, who was officially the highest-ranking civil official appointed by the emperor, seized control of the government as a military dictatorship. And the highest-ranking military official appointed by the emperor is the shogun. The shogun eventually seized control and began a line of hereditary military dictators who would, for the next few centuries, be the real ruling power in Japan. So the Tokugawa Shogunate was the third of these shogunates, and they ruled from Edo Castle in what was then called Edo, which is a city that we now call Tokyo. And this was actually the beginning of Tokyo, then called Edo, being the center of the government. So, the shogunate exercised an extreme amount of power over their subjects. They limited the ability of the daimyo to conduct wars, often through weapons confiscations. There's at least one or two massive bronze and iron Buddhas that were made because they took swords and other weapons and melted them down to make these statues. And so it was the shogunate kind of showing their ability to control the country by enforcing this peace, even if it was through confiscating the weapons of war and taking those weapons away from the samurai and the daimyo who commanded them. Now, the emperors themselves were not assassinated, as one might expect when I say that the shoguns seized power as a hereditary military dictatorship. Rather, the Yamato dynasty, the dynasty of the emperors which began millennia ago, and whose dynasty actually does still continue to this day. The Yamato dynasty persisted, but because the emperors were already regarded as gods, the emperor was relegated to an increasingly religious and ceremonial function. So the emperor presided over religious life and remained nominally the head of the nation. So, for example, when a shogun took office, often usually inheriting the position when his father died, there would still be a formal ceremony where the emperor would name him shogun and would invest him with the powers and honors of office, blah, blah, blah. But in all reality, the shogun was the real power behind the throne. The shogun commanded the army. The shogun enforced law, order, and peace. The emperor existed as a religious functionary. The job of the emperor as a god was to lead the country spiritually. That was the emperor's role. So, while all this internal issue is going on, Europe has been expanding its horizons. And as the Portuguese and others continued to sail east, it was inevitable that there would be contact between Europe and Japan. So the Portuguese reached Japan in the 1500s, and Catholic missionaries arrived in the country just as they arrived in the Americas and in Africa and in everywhere else that Catholic countries expanded. And they begin converting people in Japan to Catholicism. And initially things are actually going pretty amicably between the missionaries and the Japanese. But then things take a turn for the worse. What happens is there is a peasant rebellion in the south of Japan, and Christianity is implicated in the rebellion. It's insinuated by several of the nobles that this new religion is inciting the peasants to commit violence. Now, did the missionaries encourage the rebellion? Probably not. Now, did the nobles say this because they themselves were adverse to the missionaries? Maybe. Did the peasants maybe use religion and any kind of Christian belief in equality to try to justify their rebellion against their social superiors? It's quite possible. Around the same time in history, a similar uprising was happening in Germany, spurred on by Martin Luther's reforms, so it's certainly possible. It's entirely possible either way, that peasants might have mentioned it, or they might not have. It's also entirely possible that because a majority of the peasants involved might have been Christian, that the nobles assumed that, well, this new Christianity business must have something to do with it. All of the above are possible. What's not as debated is what happened afterwards. The samurai and the shogun managed to put down the rebellion. Once that happens, there's a crucifixion where hundreds are crucified at Nagasaki. And at this point, the shoguns are sick of outsiders, and they close the country to outsiders. Outside individuals are forbidden to enter Japan. Only one Dutch ship is allowed to enter a port in Japan every year for trade. That's it. One trading ship per year from Europe, specifically from Holland, may come and do business with the Japanese. That was it at the time. And that would remain the rule until the 1800s. So that has been the Japanese shogunate.